Why they don't want to listen to you. Chapter 1. The Silent Treatment. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent 15 years studying the human brain, but she'd never felt more misunderstood than she did sitting across from her teenage daughter at breakfast. Maya scrolled through her phone with the practiced indifference of someone who had perfected the art of selective hearing. "The presentation is tonight," Sarah said, buttering her toast with mechanical precision. "I know it's not exactly thrilling, but can't." Maya didn't look up. "Emma's having people over." Sarah paused mid-spread. She'd been about to say that her research on neural pathways and decision-making had finally been accepted by the International Journal of Cognitive Science. That tonight's presentation to the university board could change everything. That she'd discovered something profound about why people resist information that contradicts their existing beliefs. Instead, she said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had been widening for months. Sarah had theories about teenage brain development, about the prefrontal cortex and impulse control, but none of that helped when your own child looked at you like you were speaking a foreign language. Her phone buzzed. A text from her research partner, Dr. Marcus Webb. "Board moved the meeting up to 2 p.m. Emergency session. Something's wrong." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd been working on this research for 3 years, documenting how the human brain actively filters out unwanted information, even when that information could save lives, relationships, or careers. She'd called it cognitive gatekeeping, the mind's ability to simply refuse entry to uncomfortable truths. Now she wondered if the board was about to demonstrate her theory firsthand. Chapter 2. The Messenger Problem. The university's conference room felt smaller than usual, packed with faces Sarah had known for years, but who now regarded her with something between skepticism and hostility. Dean Morrison sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled in a way that made Sarah think of a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "Dr. Chun," he began, "we've reviewed your research proposal for the next phase of funding." Sarah's pulse quickened. Beside her, Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They'd submitted their proposal months ago, a comprehensive study on how unconscious bias affected information processing in high-stakes decision-making. The applications were endless: healthcare, criminal justice, politics, education. "The board has concerns," Morrison continued, "about the implications of your findings." "Implications?" Sarah kept her voice steady. "The data speaks for itself. We've documented clear patterns of selective information processing across multiple demographics. And you're suggesting that people are fundamentally irrational," interrupted Dr. Hoffman from psychology. "That we can't trust human judgment." Sarah had seen this reaction before. It was exactly what her research predicted. When presented with evidence that challenged their worldview, people didn't examine the evidence. They attacked the messenger. "I'm suggesting that we understand the mechanisms behind decision-making," Sarah replied. "If we know how the brain filters information, we can design better communication strategies, improve educational outcomes, reduce medical errors, or manipulate people more effectively." Cut in Professor Blackwell from ethics. "Your research reads like a handbook for propaganda." The room erupted in murmurs. Sarah felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. The same feeling she got when Maya rolled her eyes at her, when her ex-husband had dismissed her concerns about their marriage, when her mother refused to accept that her memory was failing. They weren't listening. They were defending. "May I ask," Sarah said, raising her voice slightly, "if any of you have actually read the full study?" The silence that followed was telling. Chapter 3. The Algorithm of Attention. That evening, Sarah sat in her empty house, staring at her laptop screen. The presentation she'd planned to give lay abandoned in a folder labeled, "Why They Don't Want to Listen." Instead, she found herself writing in her journal, a habit she'd developed during graduate school, but had abandoned somewhere between tenure track and divorce. Day 1247 of the study. "Today I became my own test subject." She paused, thinking about the board meeting, about Maya's dismissive shrug that morning, about the pattern she'd been documenting for years but had never fully experienced from the inside. The mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. The human brain, faced with information that threatens its existing structure, doesn't just ignore the data, it actively constructs defenses. It questions the source, finds flaws in the methodology, generates alternative explanations. Anything to avoid the discomfort of changing its mind. Her phone rang. "Marcus." "They're pulling our funding," he said without preamble. Sarah closed her eyes. All of it. Morrison called it potentially harmful to university relations. Said we could reapply next year with a more constructive framework. Marcus's bitterness was audible. They want us to study how to make people better listeners, not why they don't listen in the first place. After hanging up, Sarah stared out her kitchen window at the house across the street. Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden in the dark, something Sarah had noticed her doing for weeks. Tomorrow, Sarah would probably mention that plants don't need water at night, that it could actually encourage fungal growth. And Mrs. Patterson would probably smile politely and keep doing exactly what she'd always done. The thought should have been depressing. Instead, Sarah found herself smiling. She had an idea. Chapter 4, The Experiment. You want to do what? Maya looked up from her cereal, actually making eye contact for the first time in weeks. Study teenagers, Sarah repeated. Specifically, communication patterns between adolescents and adults. I think you and your friends could help me understand something important. It wasn't entirely a lie. Sarah had spent the night designing a new approach to her research, one that didn't threaten people's sense of themselves as rational actors. Instead of studying why people didn't listen, she'd study how they did. Is this going to be embarrassing? Maya asked suspiciously. Not if you don't want it to be. I'm thinking more like consulting. You know how adults are always saying kids don't listen? Well, maybe adults don't know how to talk. Maya's expression shifted from suspicion to interest. You mean like parents are bad at communicating? I mean, maybe there's something about the way adults present information that automatically triggers resistance. Maybe it's not about rebellion. Maybe it's about biology. For the first time in months, Maya was listening. Chapter 5, The Mirror Effect. Emma Rodriguez was the kind of teenager adults described as mature for her age, which usually meant she was good at telling them what they wanted to hear. She sat in Sarah's makeshift home office, speaking into a digital recorder with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. The thing is, Dr. Chun, adults think they're being helpful, but they're actually being threatening. Sarah leaned forward. Threatening how? Like, when my mom tells me I should study more, she thinks she's giving advice. But what I hear is, you're not good enough. When my dad explains why I shouldn't date Derek, he thinks he's protecting me. But what I hear is, you're too stupid to make your own decisions. Maya nodded from her chair by the window. It's like they're always trying to fix us. And then they get frustrated when we don't want to be fixed, added Tyler, Emma's boyfriend, who'd been quietly observing until now. Sarah made notes, her excitement building. What would make you more likely to listen? Questions, Emma said immediately. Like, instead of telling me I need to study more, what if my mom asked me how I feel about my grades? Instead of explaining why Derek's bad for me, what if my dad asked me what I see in him? Questions make you feel like they care about your thoughts, Maya added. Statements make you feel like they've already decided you're wrong. Sarah stared at her notes. It was so simple, so obvious, she wondered why she'd never seen it before. The teenagers weren't being irrational or rebellious. They were responding to what they perceived as attacks on their autonomy, their intelligence, their right to exist as separate beings with valid perspectives. The adults weren't trying to control or diminish them. They were responding to their own fears, their own need to protect and guide. Both sides were behaving rationally within their own frameworks. The breakdown wasn't in listening, it was in translation. Chapter 6, The Resistance Network. Sarah's unofficial research group grew over the following weeks. Word spread through Maya's friend network that Dr. Chun was studying why adults and kids don't understand each other. And teenagers began showing up at her house like moths drawn to the first adult who seemed genuinely curious about their perspective. Each conversation revealed new layers to the communication puzzle. Jason, whose parents were going through a messy divorce, talked about how adults used information as weapons. They don't tell you things to help you understand. They tell you things to win arguments. Priya, a straight-A student from an academic family, described the exhaustion of always being lectured to. My parents think they're sharing wisdom, but they never pause to see if I actually need to hear it. It's like their downloads running on automatic. But the most revealing conversation came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Patterson from across the street. Sarah had finally worked up the courage to mention the nighttime watering, framing it as a casual observation rather than criticism. Mrs. Patterson had listened politely, thanked her for the advice, and then surprised Sarah by asking, "Would you like to know why I really water at night?" They sat on Mrs. Patterson's porch as the older woman explained that her late husband had planted the garden, that watering it in the evening felt like a conversation with him, that she knew it wasn't optimal for the plants, but it was necessary for her heart. "You were trying to help," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "but you assumed the problem was ignorance when it was actually grief." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. "I never asked why you did it. I just assumed you didn't know better." "Most people do that," Mrs. Patterson smiled. "They see behavior that doesn't make sense to them and assume it doesn't make sense at all. But everyone's behavior makes sense to them, even when it looks irrational from the outside." Chapter 7. The Listening Lab. Armed with insights from her informal teenage focus group and her conversation with Mrs. Patterson, Sarah began developing what she privately called the Listening Lab, a new framework for understanding communication resistance. She started with Marcus, practicing her theories on her research partner before attempting anything more ambitious. "I need to tell you something about the funding decision," she said when he came over to work on their scaled-down research proposal. "But first, I want to understand how you're feeling about what happened." Marcus looked surprised by the question. "I'm angry, frustrated, feel like we wasted 3 years." "What's the worst part for you?" "That they didn't even engage with the research. They just dismissed it based on their fears about what it might imply." Sarah nodded. "So you feel like the work itself wasn't given fair consideration?" "Exactly." Marcus paused. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think I know how to get them to listen." Over the next hour, Sarah shared her revised approach. Instead of presenting research about why people didn't listen, she'd frame it as research about how to improve communication effectiveness. Instead of documenting cognitive bias, she'd focus on cognitive optimization. Instead of challenging their self-image as rational decision-makers, she'd position them as partners in solving a universal problem. "It's the same data," she explained, "but the framing acknowledges their intelligence and invites collaboration instead of threatening their worldview." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You're talking about manipulating them." "I'm talking about translating," Sarah corrected. "The information is the same, but I'm presenting it in a way they can actually hear." Chapter 8. The Translation Protocol. Sarah spent the weekend developing what she called the Translation Protocol, a systematic approach to information sharing that prioritized understanding over being understood. The protocol had 4 phases. Phase 1, reconnaissance. Before sharing information, understand the listener's current perspective, fears, and motivations. Phase 2, alliance. Find common ground and establish shared goals before introducing challenging concepts. Phase 3, co-discovery. Frame new information as something you're exploring together rather than conclusions you've already reached. Phase 4, integration. Give the listener space to process and respond without pressure to immediately accept or act on the information. She tested it first with Maya, approaching a conversation about college applications, a topic that had become a minefield between them. "I've been thinking about your future," Sarah began, then immediately course-corrected. "Actually, I've been wondering how you're feeling about senior year coming up, the college application process, and all that." Maya's defensive posture relaxed slightly. "It's stressful. Everyone's asking what I want to study, where I want to go. Like I'm supposed to know my whole life plan at 17. "That does sound overwhelming," Sarah agreed. "What would make it feel less stressful?" "I don't know. Maybe if people asked what I was interested in now instead of what I want to do forever." Sarah made a mental note. "What are you interested in now?" For the next 20 minutes, they had the most substantive conversation they'd shared in months. Maya talked about her psychology class, her curiosity about social media's impact on mental health, her volunteer work at the animal shelter. Sarah listened without offering advice, asked follow-up questions, and found herself genuinely surprised by her daughter's thoughtfulness. Only at the end did she share information, and even then, she framed it as curiosity rather than guidance. "There are some interesting research opportunities in behavioral psychology," she mentioned casually. "Might be worth exploring if you're interested." "No pressure." Maya nodded, actually engaged rather than resistant. "Maybe you could send me some links?" Chapter 9. The Board Revisited. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the same conference room where her research had been dismissed, but this time she felt prepared. She'd spent days applying the translation protocol to her presentation, reimagining every slide from the perspective of her audience. Instead of beginning with her findings about cognitive resistance, she started with a question: How many of you have ever had the experience of knowing you were right about something important, but being unable to convince the people who needed to hear it? Every hand in the room went up. Healthcare professionals trying to get patients to follow treatment protocols. Teachers attempting to reach struggling students. Parents communicating with teenagers. Managers implementing necessary changes. We all face the same challenge. How do we share important information in a way that actually gets through? She had their attention now, their posture leaning forward instead of defensive. For the past 3 years, Dr. Webb and I have been studying this challenge. Not to judge anyone's communication skills, but to understand the science behind why some messages are heard and others aren't. What followed was essentially the same research she'd presented before, but framed as solutions rather than problems, opportunities rather than limitations. She talked about communication optimization instead of cognitive bias. She described message design instead of manipulation resistance. The data hadn't changed. The framing had transformed everything. When she finished, Dean Morrison was the first to speak. This has significant applications across the university: student retention, faculty development, community relations. Dr. Hoffman from psychology nodded enthusiastically. The implications for therapeutic communication are enormous. Even Professor Blackwell seemed intrigued. Have you considered applications in organizational change management? They weren't just listening. They were building on her ideas. Chapter 10, The Ripple Effect. Success brought unexpected challenges. Within a month, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly with requests for consultations. School districts wanting to improve parent-teacher communication. Healthcare systems struggling with patient compliance. Corporations dealing with change resistance. But it was Maya who pointed out the real impact of her work. "You know what's weird, Mom?" she said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "We actually talk now." Sarah paused in loading the dishwasher. "We do. I mean, we always talked. But it was like we were speaking different languages. Now it feels like." Maya searched for words. "Like you're actually curious about what I think instead of just trying to fix what you think is wrong with me." The observation stung a little, but Sarah recognized its truth. "I was trying to help, but I wasn't really listening." "Most adults don't," Maya said. "They're too busy preparing their response to actually hear what you're saying." That night, Sarah updated her research notes with a new insight. The problem isn't that people don't want to listen. The problem is that we've forgotten how to speak in a way that invites listening. Chapter 11, The Deeper Pattern. As Sarah's work gained recognition, she began to see the pattern everywhere. In political discourse, where opposing sides delivered perfectly crafted arguments that never reached their intended audiences. In family therapy, where loved ones spoke past each other despite sharing the same basic goals. In international relations, where entire nations seemed locked in conversations where no one was actually listening. The mechanism was always the same. When people felt attacked, diminished, or misunderstood, they stopped processing information and started defending themselves. The original message, however important, however correct, became secondary to the need for psychological safety. But the reverse was also true. When people felt heard, respected, and intellectually safe, they became remarkably open to new information, even when it challenged their existing beliefs. Sarah began to think of it as the fundamental law of human communication. People can't learn when they're in defensive mode, and they can't stay defensive when they feel truly understood. She tested this theory in increasingly complex situations. A consulting project with a divided city council, where residents and officials had stopped listening to each other about development plans. A workshop with medical professionals struggling to communicate with vaccine-hesitant patients. A series of sessions with couples on the brink of divorce. In every case, the breakthrough came not when people learned new information, but when they felt heard sharing what they already knew. Chapter 12, The Meta Question. The success of Sarah's translation protocol created an ironic problem. Everyone wanted to learn how to make other people listen, but few were willing to examine why they themselves might not be listening. This became clear during a workshop with high school teachers struggling with disrespectful students. "These kids don't want to learn," complained Mrs. Stevens, a veteran English teacher. "They're too busy on their phones, too distracted by social media. They have no attention span." Sarah applied her protocol. "That sounds frustrating. Help me understand what you're seeing in your classroom." For 20 minutes, Mrs. Stevens described her challenges in vivid detail. students who seemed bored by literature she'd loved for decades, classes where engagement felt like pulling teeth, the exhaustion of feeling like she was performing for an unappreciative audience. "It sounds like you're not feeling heard either," Sarah observed. "You're passionate about these books, these ideas that have shaped your life, but your students aren't responding with the enthusiasm you'd hope for." Mrs. Stevens paused, something shifting in her expression. "Ah, yes, I suppose that's true. What would it be like if, instead of trying to get them to appreciate what you love, you started by trying to understand what they're passionate about?" The question hung in the air. Finally, Mrs. Stevens asked, "You mean ask them what they care about?" "I mean get genuinely curious about their inner lives. Not to manipulate them into liking Shakespeare, but to understand how their minds work. What makes them laugh, what keeps them up at night, what they worry about, what they dream about. And then what? Then you might discover that Romeo and Juliet is actually about some of the same things they're dealing with. That Hamlet's anxiety might resonate with their mental health struggles. That these centuries-old stories are still being lived every day, just in different forms." Mrs. Stevens was quiet for a long moment. "I think I've been trying to make them care about what I care about instead of finding out what they already care about. That's the meta question," Sarah said. "Not how do I get them to listen to me, but how do I listen to them in a way that creates space for genuine dialogue?"